I never thought I'd have to use my training at home. That instinct, the one that kept me alive through 3 combat tours, started as a whisper at the back of my mind. Something about Sarah wasn't right. The way she moved around me like I was a stranger in our own house. At first, I thought it was just readjustment issues. Coming back to civilian life after 15 years in special operations isn't exactly a smooth transition. But as the weeks passed, that whisper turned into a scream I couldn't ignore. I never expected that the most dangerous confrontation of my life would happen in my own living room, or that the skills I'd spent years honing would be tested not by an enemy combatant, but by my wife's lover. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I'd been home for 8 months when I first noticed the changes. After a decade and a half with the 5th Special Forces Group, transitioning back to civilian life was already a challenge. Sarah had been supportive during my military career, waiting through deployments, moving from base to base, dealing with the parts of my job I couldn't talk about. She'd been my rock, which is why the subtle shift in her behavior hit me harder than any IED ever could. It was a Tuesday evening in April when I first felt that familiar tension at the base of my neck, the same sensation that had warned me of ambushes in remote mountain passes. Sarah came home late from her job at the hospital administration office, her scrubs replaced by a dress I didn't recognize. Something about her was different. Her perfume lingered differently, her smile seemed rehearsed. "Conference ran late," she explained, brushing a quick kiss against my cheek before disappearing upstairs to shower. The kiss felt mechanical, obligatory. In 15 years of marriage, I'd never felt her kiss me like a stranger before. I tried to dismiss it. The transition had been hard on both of us. I'd gone from leading high-stakes operations to working as a security consultant for a corporate firm, spending my days behind a desk instead of in the field. The adrenaline withdrawal alone had made me irritable, distant. Maybe I was just projecting my own dissatisfaction onto her. But that night as she slept beside me, I found myself studying her face in the dim glow of streetlights filtering through our bedroom window. The woman I'd built a life with, who'd waited for me through deployments that stretched into years. Something had changed, and my training wouldn't let me ignore it. In the morning, I made her coffee the way she liked it, strong with a splash of cream, no sugar. She seemed surprised by the gesture, a flicker of guilt crossing her face before she composed herself. "What's this for?" she asked, accepting the mug. "Do I need a reason?" I replied, watching her reaction carefully. In the field, I'd been trained to notice micro-expressions, those fleeting tells that betray what people try to hide. The momentary tension around her eyes told me more than words ever could. Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention. Sarah was staying late at work 3, sometimes 4 nights a week. Her explanations were always plausible: understaffing at the hospital, new electronic record system implementation, meetings with the hospital director. But each excuse came with the same rehearsed quality, as if she'd practiced the words before. Walking through our door. Then there were the phone calls. Sarah had always been open with her phone, often asking me to check messages or answer calls when she was busy. Now, her phone never left her side. She'd step onto the back porch or into the bathroom when it rang, her voice dropping to a murmur I couldn't make out. "Hospital stuff," she'd say whenever I asked, but the flush on her neck told a different story. One evening, as we sat on opposite ends of the couch watching a documentary about marine life, something we'd have once huddled together for, I decided to test the waters. "How's Dr. Mitchell?" I asked casually. Dr. Mitchell was the hospital director, a name she'd been mentioning. With increasing frequency, Sarah's fingers stopped their endless scrolling on her phone. "He's fine," she said too quickly. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious," I replied, noting how she'd shifted her body slightly away from me. You've been working closely with him lately. He's pushing for some big changes at the hospital, she said, her eyes fixed on her phone again. It's a lot of pressure on everyone. The way she said his name, not Dr. Mitchell, but just he, carried a familiarity that made my stomach tighten. In that moment, 15 years of tactical assessment kicked in automatically. I began mentally cataloguing changes in behavior, inconsistencies. In her stories, subtle shifts in her appearance and habits. Sarah had started dressing differently for work. More makeup, more effort with her hair, clothes I didn't recognize appearing in her closet. She'd lost weight too, been more diligent about her gym routine. All things that could have innocent explanations, but the pattern was becoming harder to dismiss. I found myself using skills I'd developed, tracking high-value targets now deployed against my own wife. I hated myself for it. But once that switch had flipped, I couldn't turn it off. The hypervigilance that had kept me alive through 3 combat tours was now focused entirely on my marriage. I didn't want to believe what the evidence was suggesting. Sarah and I had weathered so much together. While my brothers in arms had seen their marriages crumble under the weight of multiple deployments and the invisible scars of combat, we'd held strong. Or so I thought. One Thursday, she mentioned another late night at the hospital. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral while my mind calculated the frequency, the 4th this week, breaking the previous pattern. After she left, I sat at our kitchen table, turning her behavior over in my mind, analyzing it like intelligence data. That's when I made a decision I never thought I'd make. I'd spent 15 years conducting surveillance on enemy combatants and high-value targets. I knew how to remain unseen, how to observe without detection. The skills that had made me effective in the field were now turned toward my own life, my own wife. I followed her that evening, maintaining distance, using the techniques that had kept me alive in hostile territory. The familiar calm of an operation settled over me, emotions locked down, senses heightened, mind clear and focused on the objective. Only this time, the objective was my wife, and the intelligence I sought would either confirm my worst fears or put them to rest. Sarah didn't go to the hospital. She drove to an upscale apartment complex on the other side of town, punching in a gate code like she'd done it 100 times before. I watched from a discreet distance as she parked, checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, and walked with purpose toward one of the buildings. The tactical part of my brain noted everything: building number, floor, approximate unit based, on which lights illuminated shortly after her arrival. The husband in me felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Still, I needed more. In the field, you never act on incomplete intelligence. Confirmation was required. I returned home and waited, putting my emotions in a box like I'd been trained to do during high-stress operations. When Sarah returned hours later, she had that same rehearsed smile, the same story about a difficult meeting, the same quick kiss that now felt like a lie against my cheek. I said nothing. Not yet. I needed more information, more certainty. The next day, I did something I'd never imagined doing. I placed a small tracking application on her phone while she was in the shower. The same technology we'd used to monitor persons of interest was now being used on my wife. The irony wasn't lost on me. Over the next week, a pattern emerged. 3 more visits to the same apartment, always under the guise of late hospital meetings. The tracker showed her location overlaid with timestamps that made her lies unmistakable. Despite the evidence, I still held out hope for an explanation that wouldn't destroy everything we'd built. Maybe she was seeing a therapist she didn't want to tell me about. Maybe she was planning some kind of surprise. The possibilities grew increasingly unlikely, but I clung to them anyway. Then came the text message. Sarah had left her phone on the kitchen counter while she was upstairs changing. It buzzed, and the preview notification flashed on the screen. "Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again tomorrow. Mitchell." Mitchell. Not Dr. Mitchell. Just Mitchell. The familiarity confirmed what I'd suspected but hadn't wanted to accept. The hospital director, her boss, the man she'd been mentioning with increasing frequency over the past months. I didn't touch her phone. I didn't need to. See more. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My training had taught me to recognize when I had sufficient intelligence to confirm a threat. And this was a threat. To my marriage, to my home, to the life we'd built together. That night, as Sarah slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling, the weight of what I'd discovered pressing down on my chest. I'd faced death in dozens of operations, made split-second decisions with lives hanging in the balance. But this, discovering my wife's betrayal, felt heavier than any combat situation I'd ever encountered. I knew I had choices to make. I could confront her immediately, lay out the evidence like a tactical briefing. I could wait, gather more intelligence, understand the full scope of the situation. Or I could deploy counterintelligence tactics, let her think I was unaware while I determined my next move. 15 years in Special Forces had taught me that rushing into unknown territory without proper preparation was how men died. I needed a plan, a strategy. And as I lay there in the dark, listening to the steady breathing of the woman who had betrayed me, I began to formulate one. What I didn't know then was that this situation would escalate beyond anything I could have anticipated. That the skills I'd honed in the world's most dangerous places would soon be tested, not in some distant battlefield, but in my own living room. And that the threat wouldn't come from my wife, but from the man who thought he could take her from me. The following days unfolded like a slow-motion ambush. I maintained my cover, acting normal, going through the routines of our life together while gathering intelligence on my wife's affair. In Special Forces, we'd operated on the principle that information is power. The more you know about your target, the more effectively you can neutralize the threat. I applied that same methodology to my current situation, though it felt perverse. To use tactics designed for warfare on my marriage, I created a detailed log of Sarah's activities, her supposed work schedule versus her actual locations according to the tracking app, her text patterns, the changes in her behavior before and after meeting Mitchell. The evidence mounted, each new data point driving the knife deeper, while the rational, tactical part of my brain processed this information dispassionately. The husband in me was dying a slow death. 15 years of marriage, of building a life, while I was deployed to some of the most dangerous places on earth, and now this betrayal in the safety of home. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd survived firefights in Kandahar and covert operations in places not found on any map, only to be blindsided in my own backyard. One evening, Sarah announced she had a late meeting with the hospital board. Her tell was visible. She touched her ear slightly as she spoke, an unconscious gesture she'd always made when lying. I'd noticed it years ago, but had never had reason to catalogue it as significant until now. "No problem," I said, keeping my voice casual. "I've got some reports to finish up anyway." She seemed relieved by my easy acceptance, which only confirmed my suspicions further. After she left, I sat at my desk, staring at the wedding photo we kept there. Sarah in white, me in my dress uniform before I'd joined the Special Forces. We looked so young, so certain of the future we were stepping into. I opened my laptop and did something I hadn't yet considered. I researched Mitchell Bennett, MD, hospital director. The digital footprint of a person tells you a lot about who they are. In the field, we'd use similar techniques to build profiles of high-value targets. Now I was using them to understand the man sleeping with my wife. Mitchell's professional profile was impressive. Harvard Medical School, residency at Johns Hopkins, published in several medical journals before transitioning to hospital administration. His social media presence was carefully curated. Charity galas, medical conferences, the occasional golf tournament. Divorced 3 years ago, no children. What caught my attention was a pattern in his professional history. Before coming to our city's hospital, he'd worked at 3 other institutions in the span of 6 years. That kind of movement was unusual for someone in his position. I dug deeper, using contacts from my security consulting work to access information that wasn't publicly available. A pattern emerged. At each previous hospital, there had been rumors of inappropriate relationships with staff. Nothing ever formalized into official complaints, but enough smoke to suggest fire. Each time, he'd moved on to a more prestigious position elsewhere, his reputation somehow untarnished. Mitchell Bennett wasn't just sleeping with my wife. He was a predator with a history of exploiting power dynamics for personal gratification. This wasn't just about Sarah's betrayal anymore. It was about a man who made a habit of this behavior, who likely saw my wife as just another conquest in his pattern. The revelation shifted something in me. In the field, understanding an adversary's motivation and pattern of behavior was crucial to predicting their next move. Mitchell wasn't just an adulterer. He was a calculated operator who'd done this before and gotten away with it. My tactical assessment of the situation evolved accordingly. I continued my intelligence gathering for another week. Sarah's patterns remained consistent. 3 or 4 nights a week at the hospital that the tracking app showed were actually spent at Mitchell's apartment. Her behavior at home grew increasingly distant, as if she were already mentally checking out of our marriage. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening. Sarah had said she'd be home for dinner, a rare occurrence lately. I'd actually felt a flicker of hope. Maybe she was reconsidering. Maybe there was still something to salvage. I cooked her favorite meal, opened a bottle of wine we'd been saving for a special occasion. 6 o'clock came and went. Then 7. At 8, I received a text. Emergency at work. Don't wait up. I checked the tracking app. She was at Mitchell's apartment. Something crystallized in me then. The same cold clarity I'd experienced in combat situations when decisions had to be made and emotions couldn't be part of the equation. I'd gathered enough intelligence. It was time to develop an action plan. In Special Forces, we never went into an operation without understanding the terrain, the target, and the objective. My terrain was my marriage and my home. My target was clear, not Sarah, but the situation itself. And my objective needed definition. What did I want? Revenge, reconciliation, a clean break. The question haunted me as I sat alone at our dining table, the meal I'd prepared growing cold, the wine untouched. I decided I needed to see them together, to witness with my own eyes what I'd been tracking digitally. It wasn't enough to know abstractly. I needed the reality of it to determine my next move. The next evening, when Sarah announced another late meeting, I nodded and kissed her goodbye. 30 minutes later, I was parked near Mitchell's apartment complex with a clear view of the entrance. I'd selected a position that offered optimal surveillance coverage while minimizing the chance of being spotted, basic fieldcraft. Sarah arrived at 7:15, parking in what appeared to be her usual spot. From my vantage point, I watched as she called. Someone from her car, Mitchell presumably, then walked to his building with a confidence that suggested familiarity. I waited. In the field, patience was often the difference between success and failure. The tactical part of my brain took over, pushing down the hurt and anger that threatened to cloud my judgment. At 10:30, Sarah emerged from the building. She wasn't alone. Mitchell walked her to her car, tall, distinguished-looking in an expensive suit despite the late hour. The way he carried himself spoke of arrogance, of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. He kissed her goodbye. His hand lingering possessively on her lower back. It was the first time I'd seen them together, and the visual confirmation hit me harder than I'd anticipated. This wasn't just data points on a tracking app or suspicious text messages. This was my wife, in another man's arms, looking at him with an intimacy that had once been reserved for me. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, forcing myself to breathe through the surge of rage that threatened to overtake me. In combat situations, I'd learned to channel adrenaline, to use it rather than letting it use me. I applied those same techniques now, slowing my heart rate, focusing my mind. I followed Sarah home, maintaining a safe distance. She never noticed me. She wasn't trained to spot surveillance, and I was. When she arrived at our house, I circled the block twice before parking down the street and walking home, giving her time to settle in and wash away the evidence of her. Evening, when I entered, she was in the kitchen making tea, her hair still damp from a shower. She looked up with a practiced smile. "How was your meeting?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. "Exhausting," she sighed. "The new insurance regulations are a nightmare." The lie slid from her lips so effortlessly that I almost admired the skill of it. Almost. "I'm sure Mitchell has a handle on it," I said, watching her carefully. Her hand paused momentarily as she reached for a mug. "Dr. Bennett," she corrected, a touch too formally. "Yes, he's been working closely with the board to find solutions." Working closely. The euphemism might have been funny if it weren't so painful. I nodded and headed upstairs, leaving her standing in the kitchen. I needed space to process what I'd seen, to plan my next move. In the shower, I let the hot water pound against my shoulders as I considered my options. Direct confrontation was the most straightforward approach, but also potentially the messiest. In the field, we always considered collateral damage in our operational planning. There would be collateral damage here too, to whatever remained of our relationship, to our shared history, to the life we'd built. As I lay in bed that night, Sarah sleeping soundly beside me as if she hadn't spent the evening in another man's bed, I made my decision. I would confront her, but on my terms, with all the evidence laid out methodically. No room for denial, no space for gaslighting. Just the cold, hard facts and a choice for her to make. What I didn't anticipate was that Mitchell would force my hand before I could execute my plan. The careful, controlled confrontation I'd been preparing for was about to be replaced by something far more volatile, something that would test, not just my marriage, but the very skills that had kept me alive through 15 years of special operations. The following Saturday morning changed everything. Sarah mentioned she needed to run errands and would be gone most of the day. I nodded, sipping my coffee, while mentally noting that it was the first weekend she'd made such plans in our 15 years together. Weekends had always been our time. Even during my active duty years, we'd protected that sacred space when I was home. "Anything specific?" I asked casually. "Just some shopping, maybe lunch with Diane." Another lie. Diane, her longtime friend, was in Europe on vacation, a fact Sarah had apparently forgotten I knew. After she left, I checked the tracking app. She drove directly to Mitchell's apartment. No pretense of work this time, just a straightforward betrayal on what should have been our time together. Something shifted in me then, a hardening, a resolve. I'd spent too long in reconnaissance mode. It was time to act. I spent the morning finalizing my approach. In special forces, we'd been taught that timing and environment were critical factors in any confrontation. I wanted to control both, to choose the moment and place that would give me tactical advantage while minimizing potential for collateral damage. I decided Sunday evening would be ideal. Sarah would be home, the work week's pressures still distant. I'd present the evidence calmly, ask for her side, then lay out my terms. No shouting, no accusations, just facts and consequences. I even wrote out talking points, treating this like the high-stakes operations briefings I'd conducted so many times before. But at 3:17 p.m., everything changed. My phone rang, a number I didn't recognize. "Hello?" I answered, stepping onto the back deck. "Is this James Wilson?" A woman's voice, professional but with an edge of concern. "Yes, who's this?" "This is Meredith from Memorial Hospital. You're listed as Sarah Wilson's emergency contact. There's been an incident." My heart slammed against my ribs. Whatever Sarah had done, whatever betrayal I was processing, she was still my wife. "What happened? Is she all right?" "She's stable," Meredith assured me. "She fainted and hit her head. Nothing serious, but Dr. Bennett thought we should call you." "Dr. Bennett, of course he was there." "I'll be right over," I said, already grabbing my keys. The drive to the hospital was a blur. My mind raced through possibilities. Was Sarah actually injured, or was this some elaborate cover story? Had she told Mitchell about me, about my suspicions? Was this their way of managing the situation? At the hospital, I was directed to the 3rd floor. As I stepped off the elevator, I saw him for the first time in person, Mitchell Bennett, MD, hospital director. He was standing at the nurses' station, reviewing a chart, looking every bit the distinguished medical professional. In his white coat with an expensive watch glinting on his wrist, he looked up as I approached, recognition flashing in his eyes. He'd clearly seen photos of me, knew exactly who I was. For a moment we just stared at each other, two men sizing up an adversary. "Mr. Wilson," he said finally, extending his hand with practiced charm. "I'm Dr. Bennett. Sarah's just down the hall. Nothing serious. Low blood pressure caused a vasovagal episode. She hit her head when she fell, but the CT scan is clear." I shook his hand, noting his firm grip, a man who wanted to project strength. "Where is she?" "Room 312. She's resting, but you can go in." He smiled, the picture of professional concern. "She was quite worried about bothering you." "I bet she was." "Thank you, doctor," I replied, my voice neutral, revealing nothing of what I knew. 15 years of special operations had made me adept at wearing masks when necessary. As I turned to leave, he added, "Sarah's one of our most valuable team members. We take care of our own here." The possessive undertone wasn't subtle. This wasn't just a doctor concerned about his administrator. This was a man marking his territory. I nodded without responding and walked to Sarah's room. She was lying in bed, a small bandage on her forehead, her face pale. When she saw me, a complex mix of emotions crossed her face: relief, guilt, fear. "James," she said, reaching for my hand, "you didn't have to come. It's nothing serious." I took her hand, the familiar touch now feeling like it belonged to a stranger. "You're in the hospital, of course I came." For the next hour, I played the role of concerned husband. I listened to the discharge instructions, helped her gather her things, drove her home in silence. She attributed my quietness to worry, apologizing repeatedly for causing a fuss. Back home, I helped her to bed, brought her water and the painkillers the doctor had prescribed. She seemed genuinely touched by my attentiveness, which only deepened the sense of betrayal. How could she accept my care while living a double life? "You should rest," I told her, adjusting her pillows. "I'll check on you later." As I turned to leave, she caught my wrist. "James," she said, her voice small. "Thank you. I know things have been distant between us lately." The understatement was almost laughable. I just nodded and left the room. Downstairs, I poured myself 2 fingers of whiskey and sat at the kitchen table, reviewing what had just happened. The interaction with Mitchell had changed the equation. This wasn't just about Sarah's infidelity anymore. There was something predatory in the way he'd looked at me, something challenging in his tone. My phone buzzed with a text message. "Unknown number. She's fine, just a minor incident. You seem like a reasonable man. We should talk sometime. Mitchell Bennett, MD." The audacity stunned me. He'd gotten my number from her phone or the hospital records and was reaching out directly. This wasn't the behavior of someone trying to keep an affair secret. This was bold, territorial, a direct challenge. I didn't respond. In tactical situations, giving away your position unnecessarily is always a mistake. Let him wonder. Let him stew. Sunday passed with Sarah resting and me maintaining the appearance of the dutiful husband while internally processing this new development. My planned confrontation would have to wait until she was recovered. I didn't want any physical ailment to become an excuse or distraction from the real issue. Monday morning, Sarah insisted on going to work, despite my suggestion that she take another day to recover. "I have too much on my plate," she said, applying makeup to cover the bruise on her forehead. "Besides, I feel fine." I knew what she wasn't saying, that Mitchell would be expecting her, that their little drama had likely intensified whatever was happening between them. The damsel in distress and her medical night. "If you're sure," I said, watching her in the mirror. She met my eyes in the reflection, and for a moment I thought I saw regret there. "I'm sure." After she left, I received another text from Mitchell's number. "She's safe at work. When are we going to have that talk?" This time I responded, "What exactly do you want to talk about, Dr. Bennett?" His reply came quickly. "I think we both know. Let's be adults about this. Drinks at the Weston bar, 6 p.m.? The Weston. The hotel bar. A public place where a scene would be embarrassing. He was smart, I'd give him that. But he didn't know who he was dealing with. "I prefer to keep personal matters private," I texted back. "My house, 8 p.m. Sarah works late on Mondays." There was a long pause before his response. "I'll be there." I spent the day preparing. Not in the way most men might prepare for a confrontation. With their wife's lover. No drinking to build courage, no practicing angry speeches in the mirror. Instead, I prepared the way I'd been trained to prepare for any high-risk encounter. First, I secured the environment. I moved anything that could be used as a weapon out of the living room. I positioned the furniture to give myself clear sightlines and multiple exit options. I set up my phone to record the conversation discreetly. Then I prepared myself mentally. I ran through various scenarios, anticipating Mitchell's likely approaches and formulating my responses. I reminded myself of my objective: not violence, not revenge, but clarity and resolution. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. At 7:58 p.m., a black Mercedes pulled into my driveway. Mitchell Bennett stepped out, dressed in an expensive suit, looking like he was arriving for a business meeting rather than a confrontation with a man whose wife he was sleeping with. The casualness of it, the arrogance, confirmed everything. I'd assessed about his character. I opened the front door before he could ring the bell. For a moment, we stood facing each other on the threshold of my home. The place I'd built a life with Sarah, the place this man had violated through his actions even before physically entering it. "Dr. Bennett," I said evenly. "Come in." He stepped. Inside, glancing around with thinly veiled curiosity, a man entering his rival's territory, taking its measure. "Call me Mitchell," he said, his tone suggesting we were colleagues meeting for the first time. "Thank you for agreeing to talk. I think it's the civilized way to handle these complicated situations." I closed the door behind him, feeling a calm settle over me, the same clarity of purpose I'd experienced in combat situations when objectives were clear and emotions were a liability. "Let's sit down," I said, gesturing to the living room. "I think we have a lot to discuss." As he moved past me into my home, I knew this conversation would change everything. What I didn't realize was just how quickly it would escalate beyond words, and how grateful I would be for the training that had become second nature over 15 years in Special Forces. Mitchell Bennett settled into my living room with the ease of a man accustomed to owning any space he entered. He chose the armchair rather than the couch, a power move, positioning himself like the authority figure in the room. I remained standing for a moment, observing his body language, then deliberately took a seat on the couch across from him. Close enough for conversation, far enough to maintain tactical advantage. Can I offer you a drink? I asked the consummate host despite the circumstances. Scotch, if you have it, he replied, unbuttoning his suit jacket as he leaned back. I poured 2 glasses, noting how he watched my movements. He was assessing me just as I was assessing him, though I doubted he was doing so with the benefit of specialized training in human intelligence gathering. So, I said, handing him his glass and taking my seat again, let's drop the pretense. You're sleeping with my wife. His expression didn't change, but a slight tightening around his eyes betrayed his surprise at my directness. He'd expected dancing around the subject, perhaps some emotional outburst. Sarah and I have a connection, he said carefully, sipping his scotch. These things happen, James. Marriages evolve. People grow apart. Is that what happened at your previous hospitals too? I asked. Just connections forming naturally as marriages evolved. This time the surprise was unmistakable. He hadn't expected me to know about his history. I see you've been doing your homework. He recovered quickly. But whatever you think you know, 3 hospitals in 6 years, I continued calmly, each time moving on after rumors of inappropriate relationships with staff. It's a pattern, Mitchell. Sarah's just the latest. He placed his glass down, his casual demeanor slipping. My professional history isn't relevant to this discussion. It establishes context, I countered. In my line of work, understanding patterns is essential for predicting future behavior. And what line of work is that exactly? He asked, attempting to regain control of the conversation. Sarah mentioned security consulting, but she was rather vague on the details. I smiled slightly. There's a reason for that vagueness. Before consulting, I spent 15 years in special forces, gathering intelligence, assessing threats, neutralizing hostile situations. It becomes second nature after a while. I let that information settle, watching as he processed its implications. The slight shift in his posture, the reassessment happening behind his eyes, I could almost see him recalculating his approach. Impressive background, he said finally, but I'm not sure how it applies to our current situation. It applies because I've been gathering intelligence on you and Sarah for weeks, I said, maintaining eye contact. I know when the affair started. I know how often you meet. I know about your apartment on the west side of town. I even know about the text messages. Last night was amazing. And so on. His jaw tightened, but he didn't deny anything. Instead, he leaned forward, switching tactics. If you've known for weeks, why confront me now? Why not Sarah? Sarah will have her own conversation with me. This is about you and me, establishing boundaries. He laughed, a short, dismissive sound. Boundaries. I think those have already been crossed, don't you? That's exactly why we need to define new ones, I replied, my voice level. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to end this affair. No more contact with Sarah outside of strictly professional interaction. You're going to back away cleanly and completely. Mitchell's expression hardened. The charming doctor was gone, replaced by something colder, more calculating. And if I don't, he challenged, then I'll take the evidence I've gathered about your pattern of behavior to the hospital board. I imagine they'd be interested to know about your history of targeting employees for sexual relationships, especially in today's climate. His eyes narrowed. That sounds like blackmail. I prefer to think of it as presenting options and consequences, I replied. Something I did quite often in my previous career. Mitchell stood abruptly, pacing across my living room. I remained seated, tracking his movements, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands flexed at his sides. You don't understand what's happening here, he said finally, turning to face me. Sarah came to me. She was unhappy, unfulfilled. Do you even know your own wife anymore? What she wants, what she needs? I know she deserves better than being another notch on your bedpost, I replied. Another woman you'll discard when you move on to the next hospital, the next conquest. He moved closer, looming over me, another attempt at physical intimidation. You think this is just some casual fling? We're in love, James. She's planning to leave you. The words were designed to wound, to provoke an emotional response. 15 years ago, before my training, they might have succeeded. Now I simply absorbed them, analyzing their veracity based on all the intelligence I'd gathered. Is that what she told you? I asked, remaining seated, refusing to rise to his challenge. She doesn't need to tell me. I know her in ways you never have. His voice dripped with condescension. While you were off playing soldier, I was there for her, understanding her, appreciating her. I stood then, deliberately, measuring the movement so that when I reached my full height, I was standing, just inside his personal space, not threatening but not backing down either. Let me be very clear, I said quietly. I'm giving you one chance to walk away from this situation with your career and reputation intact. End it with Sarah, and we all move forward separately. His face flushed with anger. You don't get to dictate terms to me. This isn't one of your military operations. This is real life, and in real life you've already lost. Lost what exactly? I asked. A wife who's being manipulated by a man with a documented history of workplace predation. I'd call that dodging a bullet, the calculated indifference in... My tone pushed him over the edge. Mitchell grabbed my collar, his face inches from mine. Listen to me, you self-righteous bastard, he hissed. Sarah is leaving you. We've already discussed it. She's just waiting for the right moment, so you can take your threats and your ultimatums and shove them up your ass. I looked down at his hand, gripping my shirt, then back up to his eyes. My expression calm. You're going to want to remove your hand. Or what? He sneered. You'll go cry to the hospital board. Tell them the big bad doctor stole your wife. Grow up. She chose me. In that moment, watching the arrogance on his face, I made a decision. Sometimes in the field, demonstrations of capability are more effective than words. I needed to show Mitchell exactly who he was dealing with, not to intimidate through violence, but to establish irrefutable reality. In one fluid motion, the result of thousands of hours of training, I broke his grip, twisted his arm behind his back, and positioned him face first against the wall. The move was controlled, precise, applying pressure without causing injury, a demonstration, not an attack. 15 years in Special Forces teaches you many things, I said quietly, holding him immobile with minimal effort. Situational awareness, threat assessment, and how to neutralize someone twice your size without breaking a sweat. I released him immediately and stepped back, hands open at my sides, non-threatening, but ready. Mitchell spun around, rage and shock battling for dominance. On his face, "You're insane," he sputtered, straightening his jacket with shaking hands. "Do you have any idea who I am? I'll have you arrested for assault." "That would be difficult without witnesses or injuries," I replied calmly. "And it might raise uncomfortable questions about why you were in my home discussing your affair with my wife." He pointed a finger at me, his composed exterior completely shattered. "This isn't over. You think you can threaten me, manhandle me, and I'll just walk away? You have no idea what I'm capable of." "Actually, I have a very clear understanding of what you're capable of," I said. "That's why we're having this conversation." "Sarah will hear about this," he warned, moving toward the door. "She'll see exactly what kind of man she married, a thug who resorts to violence when he doesn't get his way. By all means, tell her your version," I replied, following him at a distance. "I have the entire conversation recorded, including your admission of the affair and your attempt at physical intimidation. I'm sure she'd find it illuminating." He froze with his hand on the doorknob, turning to stare at me with naked hatred. "You recorded this?" I nodded toward the coffee table where my phone sat. Standard procedure for high-risk encounters. Another habit from my previous career. Mitchell's face contorted with fury. "You'll regret this," he said, yanking the door open. "Both of you will." As he stormed to his car, I remained in the doorway, watching. He peeled out of my driveway, tires squealing on the pavement, a petty display of defiance. I closed the door and leaned against it, finally allowing myself to feel the emotions I'd been controlling throughout the confrontation. Anger, betrayal, grief, they washed over me in waves, but beneath them was something I hadn't expected: clarity. The Mitchell Bennett I'd just encountered wasn't a man in love. He was a predator whose territory had been challenged. His concern wasn't for Sarah's happiness, but for his own pride, his own conquest. I moved to the couch and picked up my phone, stopping the recording. The evidence was clear now, but what to do with it was less so. The confrontation had changed things in ways I hadn't anticipated. Mitchell's threat, "This isn't over," wasn't just angry words. I'd seen enough men like him to recognize when pride overrides reason. What had been a personal matter between a husband and wife had escalated into something more volatile. I'd need to prepare accordingly, not just for my conversation with Sarah, but for whatever Mitchell might do next. As I sat in the quiet of my living room, I realized that the skills I'd honed in combat zones halfway around the world might soon be needed right here, in the home I'd thought was my sanctuary. The thought didn't frighten me. If anything, it brought a familiar focus, a clarity of purpose I'd been missing in civilian life. Whatever came next, I would be ready. Sarah came home late that night, well after Mitchell had left. I heard her key in the lock just after midnight. Much later than her usual work evenings. She moved quietly through the house, probably assuming I was asleep. I wasn't. I sat in the darkened living room, still processing the confrontation with Mitchell, weighing my options for what came next. In Special Forces, we'd been trained to conduct immediate after-action reviews following any operation. What went according to plan, what didn't, what intelligence proved accurate or inaccurate, what contingencies should be prepared for next time. I found myself running through the same mental checklist now, analyzing every word, every gesture, every reaction from my confrontation with Mitchell. "James," Sarah called out softly, startled when she noticed my silhouette. "Why are you sitting in the dark?" I reached over and switched on the lamp. The sudden light revealed the evidence of the evening. 2 whiskey glasses on the coffee table, one still half full, the furniture slightly rearranged from when I'd positioned Mitchell against the wall. Sarah froze, her eyes fixed on the glasses. "Someone was here?" "Mitchell Bennett," I replied calmly. "We had a conversation that was long overdue." The color drained from her face. She gripped the back of the armchair, the same one Mitchell had occupied hours earlier. For a moment, she seemed to teeter, as if her legs might give out. I watched her regain her composure, a skill I recognized from years of observing people in crisis. "What are you talking about?" she managed. But the question was performative. Her eyes already showed understanding. "I think you know exactly what. I'm talking about Sarah." I kept my voice even, controlled. "The affair, the lies, all of it." She opened her mouth, closed it again. The denial she'd prepared died on her lips as she registered the certainty in my expression. Her shoulders slumped slightly, the physical manifestation of a tactical retreat. "How long have you known?" she finally asked, her voice barely above. A whisper, long enough to confirm it wasn't just paranoia on my part. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees. "The late nights, the secretive phone calls, the trips to his apartment that you claimed were work meetings." "I know all of it, Sarah." Her eyes widened slightly at the specificity of my knowledge. I could almost see her mental recalculation, wondering exactly how much I knew, how I'd discovered it, what evidence I might have gathered. She sank into the armchair, her purse sliding to the floor, forgotten. The expensive leather bag, new I'd noticed, though I couldn't recall when she'd bought it, landed with a soft thud against the hardwood. "James, Don't," I interrupted, raising a hand. "Don't insult both of us with excuses or justifications. Just tell me one thing. Did you ever plan to come clean, or was I supposed to remain the oblivious husband indefinitely?" Her eyes filled with tears. She blinked rapidly, fighting to maintain composure. "It's complicated." "No, it's actually quite simple," I countered. "You made vows to me. You broke them. The only complicated part is why, and whether there's anything left to salvage here." I noticed her left hand twisting her wedding ring, a nervous habit she'd had since the day I'd placed it there 15 years ago. The familiar gesture stirred something in me, a memory of a different Sarah, a different us. "He told me you confronted him," she said, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "He said you threatened him, manhandled him." I smiled without humor. "Did he mention that he grabbed me first, or that he came into our home and bragged about sleeping with my wife?" Somehow, I doubt his version included those details. "He said you recorded the conversation," she continued. "Is that true?" I nodded, sliding my phone across the coffee table toward her. "Every word, including his admission that you're just the latest in a pattern for him. 3 hospitals in 6 years, Sarah. 3 hospitals with rumors of inappropriate relationships that magically disappeared when he moved on. Did you know that?" Her expression told me she didn't. Something flashed across her face. Hurt, betrayal, maybe even anger. Another piece of information Mitchell had conveniently withheld. "I don't need to hear it," she said, pushing the phone back toward me. "I believe you." We sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of 15 years of marriage hanging between us like a suspended bridge about to collapse. I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a wedding gift from her parents, marking the seconds of this new, uncomfortable reality. "What happens now?" she finally asked. "That depends on you," I said. "On what you want, and whether you're willing to be honest about it, with me and with yourself." She looked down at her hands, twisted together in her lap. The diamond in her wedding ring caught the light, sending tiny prisms dancing across the coffee table between us. "I don't know what I want anymore. I thought I did, but now—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "Everything's a mess." "Mitchell said you were planning to leave me," I said, watching her closely. In interrogations, we'd been taught that the moment following an unexpected question often reveals more truth than the verbal answer that follows. Was he telling the truth? Sarah looked up, her eyes meeting mine directly for the first time since she'd come home. I saw shame there, but also a determination to face what she'd done. "We had talked about it," she admitted. "He wanted me to leave, said we could start fresh somewhere else." Her emphasis on "he wanted" wasn't lost on me. "And what did you want?" Sarah sighed deeply, pushing her hair back from her face with both hands, a gesture of someone trying to clear their thoughts, to find words for complex emotions. "I wanted—" She hesitated, searching for words. "I wanted to feel alive again. After you came back from your last deployment, something was different. You were here physically, but mentally, emotionally, you were still somewhere else." Mitchell made me feel seen, appreciated. The honesty stung, but I couldn't deny the truth in her words. The transition to civilian life hadn't been smooth. I'd brought home pieces of the war that had no place in our marriage. Hypervigilance, emotional distance, the inability to discuss the experiences that had shaped me. The skills that had kept me alive in combat zones had created barriers in my marriage. "That's fair," I acknowledged. "But an affair isn't the answer to marital problems, Sarah. Communication is, counseling is, commitment is." "I know," she whispered, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I made a terrible mistake. I just didn't know how to reach you anymore." I stood up, needing movement to process the swirl of emotions. This was unfamiliar terrain. In the field, Emotions were liabilities to be contained, controlled. Here, they were the entire battlefield. "I'm not blameless here," I said, pacing slowly across the living room. "I came home from war, but I never fully came back to you. That's on me." Sarah watched me move, her expression a mixture of surprise and cautious hope. Where does that leave us? It was the central question, the one I'd been avoiding for weeks as I gathered intelligence, planned my approach, prepared for confrontation. Now that the moment had arrived, I found myself without a clear tactical objective. In the field, mission parameters were explicit. Here, success could take many forms, and I wasn't sure which one to pursue. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced down at the screen and felt a cold certainty settle in my gut. "Mitchell, this isn't over. Hope you said goodbye to your marriage." I showed Sarah the message. Her eyes widened as she read it, her hand coming up to cover her mouth. "He's angry," she said, an edge of fear creeping into her voice. "When I left his place tonight, he was furious, drinking heavily, ranting about making you pay. I thought he was just blowing off steam." "When did you leave him?" I asked, putting together the timeline. "Around 11, she replied. "He kept trying to convince me not to come home, said you'd brainwash me. When I insisted on leaving, he threw his glass against the wall. I've never seen him like that." "Men like Mitchell don't handle wounded pride well," I said, the tactical part of my brain already assessing potential threats and responses. "His type is dangerous when challenged." "Dangerous how?" Sarah looked genuinely alarmed now, her own problems momentarily forgotten in the face of a more immediate concern. "You don't think he'd actually try to hurt you?" "I think he's unpredictable right now," I answered honestly, "and unpredictable people make poor decisions." I moved to the front window, checking the street outside, a habit from countless missions in hostile territory. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful, no sign of Mitchell's black Mercedes. "Should we call the police?" Sarah asked, standing now, her arms wrapped protectively around herself. I considered the option. What evidence did we have? An angry text message from a jilted lover. It wasn't enough to prompt action from law enforcement, not yet. "And tell them." "Or what?" I replied. "That your lover is upset because I confronted him about the affair. They can't do anything based on a vague text." Sarah flinched at the word lover, but didn't argue the point. "What do we do then?" "We wait," I said. "But we prepare." I moved through the house methodically, checking locks on doors and windows, drawing blinds, creating a secure perimeter. Sarah followed me, watching this side of me, the tactical operator, that she'd rarely seen during our marriage. "You really think he might come here?" she asked as I tested the back door's deadbolt. "I don't know," I admitted. "But in my experience, it's better to be prepared for threats that don't materialize than unprepared for ones that do." As if on cue, headlights swept across our living room as a car pulled into our driveway. Through the window, I recognized the black Mercedes. "He's here," I said quietly, my body automatically shifting into a state of heightened awareness, a combat mindset I hadn't accessed since leaving the service. "Go upstairs, Sarah." "James, now," I insisted, my tone leaving no room for argument. "Lock the bedroom door and call 911 if you hear anything that concerns you." She hesitated, then nodded, hurrying up the stairs as the first heavy knock sounded. At our door, I took a deep breath, centering myself. The confrontation I'd had with Mitchell earlier had been calculated, controlled. Whatever was about to happen now would be different. The Mitchell outside my door wasn't the composed doctor who'd arrived earlier. He was drunk, angry, and feeling emasculated, a dangerous combination. As I moved toward the door, I felt a familiar calm settle over me, the mental state that had carried me through dozens of high-risk operations. Time seemed to slow as my senses sharpened, cataloging every detail, every potential variable. I could hear Mitchell's breathing on the other side of the door, heavy, irregular. I detected the faint smell of expensive scotch. Through the peephole, I could see him swaying slightly, one hand braced against the doorframe. His other hand was concealed in his jacket pocket. That detail raised immediate alarms. In the field, hidden hands were a prime indicator of potential weapons. I adjusted my mental threat assessment accordingly, preparing for multiple scenarios as I positioned myself to the side of the door rather than directly in front of it. Whatever Bennett had planned for tonight, he had no idea who he was really dealing with. 15 years in Special Forces hadn't just taught me how to fight, it had taught me how to win. And sometimes winning meant avoiding the fight altogether. "Dr. Bennett," I called through the door, keeping my voice level. "It's late, and this isn't a good time. Why don't you go home, sober up, and we can talk tomorrow if you still want to?" His response was immediate and profane, a stream of curses followed by another, harder pounding on the door. I weighed my options quickly. Keeping an agitated, potentially armed man outside could lead to a public disturbance, possibly involving neighbors or escalating the situation beyond my control. Engaging him on my terms, in my environment, might be the safer approach for everyone involved. But first, I needed to ensure Sarah's safety. I texted her quickly. "Stay in the bedroom, lock the door, be ready to call 911. I'm going to let him in and try to diffuse the situation." Her response came seconds later. "Be careful, I love you." The 3 words hit me with unexpected force. When was the last time she'd said that to me, and meant it? I pushed the thought aside. Emotions were a distraction I couldn't afford right now. I turned back to the door, prepared for whatever came next. The pounding on the door continued, growing more insistent with each passing second. I moved deliberately, scanning the entryway for potential hazards or advantages. My training had taught me to transform any environment into tactical terrain, even my own home. "Wilson, open this door. I know you're in there." Mitchell's voice was slurred but forceful. He'd clearly been drinking heavily since our earlier encounter. I positioned myself to the side of the door, reducing my profile as a potential target. "Dr. Bennett," I called out calmly, "it's late and you're obviously intoxicated. Go home. We can talk tomorrow when you're sober. Open the goddamn door or I'll break it down." The door shuddered as he threw his weight against it. From upstairs I heard Sarah's frightened voice. "James, what's happening?" "Stay in the bedroom," I called back, loud enough for her to hear, but keeping my tone controlled. "Everything's under control." I assessed my options quickly. Leaving an unstable, intoxicated man outside could escalate the situation, potentially involving neighbors or creating a public disturbance. Controlled engagement on my terms seemed the better option. But first, I needed to prepare the battlefield. Moved swiftly through the entryway, securing loose objects that could become improvised weapons, noting escape routes, creating space for maneuver. 15 years of combat training had made this kind of environmental assessment second nature. "I'm opening the door," I announced, "but you need to calm down." I unlocked the door and stepped back, maintaining tactical distance. The door flew open, banging against the wall with enough force to crack the drywall. Mitchell Bennett staggered, in a man transformed from the composed doctor of hours earlier. His expensive suit was disheveled, tie loosened and hanging askew. His normally perfect hair was a mess, plastered with sweat to his forehead. His eyes had the unfocused rage of a man running on alcohol and adrenaline. "Where is she?" he demanded, staggering slightly as he entered my home, uninvited for the second time that day. I remained calm, keeping my hands visible but ready. "Sarah is not part of this conversation," I replied, my voice steady. "This is between you and me." He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed through the hallway. "Everything. It's about Sarah. She's the whole point." His hand slipped inside his jacket and my body tensed automatically. "You think you can threaten me, manhandle me, take her from me?" When his hand emerged, it was holding a small revolver. Time slowed to a crawl as my combat training took over. I catalogued every detail in milliseconds. 38 caliber, likely 5. Shots, shaking in his unsteady grip. Finger already on the trigger rather than along the guard. A dangerous combination of inexperience and emotional volatility. "Mitchell," I said, keeping my voice calm while my mind calculated angles and distances. "You're a doctor. You help people. This isn't who you are." "You don't know who I am," he shouted, the gun wavering as he gesticulated wildly. "You're just some washed-up soldier who couldn't keep his wife satisfied." I recognized the psychological state immediately, what we called emotional tunnel vision in the field. His focus had narrowed to a single objective, blinding him to consequences. Or alternatives? It made him dangerous but also predictable. "Put the gun down," I said quietly. "This doesn't end well for anyone if you don't." "It ends with you understanding that you can't win," he snarled, taking another unsteady step forward. "Sarah is mine. Now she'll always be mine." I heard a gasp from the staircase. Despite my instructions, Sarah stood frozen on the steps, her face pale with shock as she took in the scene. Mitchell standing in our entryway, gun in hand. "Mitchell!" she cried out. "What are you doing?" His head snapped toward her voice, his expression softening momentarily. The gun dipped slightly as his focus shifted. "Sarah, baby, I'm handling this. Go get your things, we're leaving." The momentary distraction was all I needed. In one fluid motion, drilled into muscle memory through thousands of repetitions, I closed the distance between us. 3 steps, executed with precision that would have made my combat instructors proud. Step 1. Grip his wrist with my left hand, driving upward to direct the weapon away from both Sarah and myself. Step 2. Strike with the heel of my right palm, driving up under his chin with precisely calibrated force, enough to break his focus without causing permanent injury. Step 3. Pivot my body weight, using his own forward momentum to destabilize his balance. The impact broke his focus, loosening his grip on the weapon. As the gun clattered to the floor, I swept his legs, controlling his descent to minimize injury while neutralizing the threat. Within seconds, I had him face down, his arm locked behind him in a restraint hold that allowed me to maintain control. With minimal force. "Sarah," I said calmly, not taking my eyes off Mitchell, "kick the gun away and call the police." Mitchell struggled beneath me, his expensive suit now collecting dust from the hardwood floor. "Get off me," he growled, his words muffled against the floor. "Stop fighting," I advised him quietly. "You're only making it worse for yourself." I applied slight additional pressure to the restraint, not enough to cause injury, just enough to remind him of the futility of resistance. He groaned, but stopped struggling. Sarah had moved down the stairs and kicked the revolver well away from Mitchell's reach. Her hands shook visibly as she dialed 911 on her phone. "Yes," I heard her say, her voice unsteady. "We need police at 1472 Ridgeline Drive. A man with a gun broke into our home. My husband has him restrained, but please hurry." Mitchell tried to buck again, using his superior weight against me. In the field, I'd subdued men larger and more skilled than him. I adjusted my position slightly, applying targeted pressure to counter his resistance. "You've ruined everything," he spat, still trying to twist free. "I loved her. We were going to start a new life, Mitchell," I said, my voice low enough that only he could hear. "Listen carefully. You came to another man's house with a gun. That's attempted murder. Your career, your freedom, they're hanging by a thread right now. The only chance you have is to stop fighting and start thinking clearly." Something in my tone must have penetrated his rage. His body went slack beneath me, the fight draining out of him as reality began to break through his emotional haze. "My life is over," he whispered, and for the first time I heard the fear beneath the anger. "Not over," I replied, maintaining the restraint hold, but adjusting to reduce discomfort. "But it's going to change, and how much depends on what you do next." I glanced up at Sarah, who stood a few feet away, arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her face was a mask of shock and disbelief, the full reality of Mitchell's character finally revealed. The man she thought she loved had come armed to her home, threatening her husband's life. Whatever fantasy she'd built around their relationship was crumbling before her eyes. "The police are on their way," she said quietly. I nodded. "It's going to be okay." Mitchell laughed bitterly from beneath me. "Nothing is going to be okay. You've won, soldier boy. Congratulations." "This isn't about winning," I told him, hearing sirens in the distance. "It's about doing the right thing. Something you should have thought about before starting an affair with a married woman and bringing a gun to her home." "You don't understand," Mitchell murmured, his voice breaking. "She was everything to me, the only real thing in my life." "No," I said firmly. "She was a conquest, another name to add to your list. If it had been real, you wouldn't have put her in danger like this." The sirens grew louder, and blue lights began to flash through our windows. I maintained the restraint hold, keeping pressure consistent, firm enough to control, gentle enough to avoid injury. In the military, we'd been taught that how you treat a subdued enemy speaks volumes about your character and training. We stayed in that position, Mitchell restrained on the floor, me maintaining the hold, Sarah standing guard by the door, until we heard the wail of approaching sirens. Red and blue lights flashed through our windows as police cars pulled up outside. "Sarah," I said, "go let them in and explain the situation." She nodded and opened the door as two officers approached, hands on their holstered weapons. "The gun is over there," she said immediately, pointing to where she'd kicked it. "My husband has the intruder restrained." The officers entered cautiously, quickly securing the weapon before approaching us. One officer knelt beside us, his hand on his own weapon as a precaution. "Good restraint technique," he commented professionally. "Military?" "Special forces," I replied briefly. 15 years. He nodded with understanding. "We can take it from here, sir." I carefully transferred control to the officer, who efficiently cuffed Mitchell's wrists behind his back. As they helped him to his feet, I stepped back, the adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation beginning to ebb. Mitchell looked nothing like the confident, arrogant doctor who had first entered my home hours earlier. His expensive suit was wrinkled and dirty, his face blotchy from alcohol and emotion. His earlier bravado was replaced by the hollow expression of a man watching his life unravel. As the officers read him his rights, his eyes met mine one last time. "I never thought it would end like this," he said quietly. "Few people do," I replied, recognizing the universal truth in those words. In my years of service, I'd seen many men face moments when their choices caught up with them, when the consequences they'd never considered became unavoidable reality. The police led him outside to a waiting patrol car. One officer remained to take our statements while the other secured the scene. Sarah sat on the couch, answering questions mechanically, still processing the night's events. I watched her from across the room, seeing her in a new light. The woman who had betrayed me, who had lied to my face for months, now seemed smaller somehow, vulnerable, human in her flaws and mistakes. The anger I'd nursed for weeks hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something more complex, more nuanced. When my turn came to provide a statement, I gave a concise, factual account of both confrontations, the earlier meeting and Mitchell's return with the weapon. I described the restraint techniques I'd used, emphasizing that I'd employed minimal, necessary force to neutralize the threat without causing injury. The officer took notes, occasionally glancing up with an expression that suggested he was reassessing his initial impression of me. "You handled this professionally," he commented. As he finished writing, "Most civilians wouldn't have maintained that level of control." "I had specialized training," I said simply, not elaborating. Men who'd served in special operations rarely discussed their experiences in detail. He nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. "We'll need both of you to come to the station tomorrow to provide formal statements. The district attorney will want to speak with you about pressing charges." I glanced at Sarah, who sat with her head bowed, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "We'll be there." After the police left, taking Mitchell and his weapon with them, Sarah and I were alone in the sudden quiet of our home. The place that had been our sanctuary, then the site of betrayal, and now the scene of violence. She looked at me across the room, her eyes swimming with emotions I couldn't begin to unravel. "You saved my life," she said finally. "Our lives." I shook my head. "I just did what I was trained to do." "No," she insisted, her voice stronger now. "It was more than that. You could have hurt him. You had every right to. But you controlled the situation, protected everyone, even him." She paused, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I didn't deserve that protection, not after what I did to you." I crossed the room slowly and sat beside her on the couch, leaving space between us. "Everyone deserves protection from violence, Sarah, no matter what mistakes they've made." She looked down at her hands, twisted together in her lap. "How can you be so calm? After everything that's happened tonight, after everything I've done?" It was a fair question, one I'd asked myself many times over the years. How did I remain functional in situations that would paralyze most people with fear or rage? The answer had been drilled into me through years of training, hardened by real-world experience in combat zones around the world. In special forces, we're taught that emotions are luxury items in crisis situations, I explained. You set them aside, do what needs to be done, and process them later when it's safe. "And now? Is it safe now?" she asked, looking up at me. Considered the question. Mitchell was in custody. The immediate danger had passed, but the emotional threat, the damage to our marriage, the broken trust, the uncertain future, that remained. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "But I do know. We both need time to process what's happened. Not just tonight, but everything leading up to it." She nodded, wiping away tears with the back of her hand. "What happens now? With us, I mean." It was the question I'd been asking myself for weeks and still had no clear answer for. The events of the night had changed the equation in ways I was still processing. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "We can't go back to how things were before. Too much has happened." She nodded, accepting this truth. "Can we go forward? Is there anything left to save?" I thought about all we'd been through, the deployments, the homecomings, the life we'd built, and the trust that had been broken. And I thought about the look on her face when she'd seen Mitchell with the gun, the moment of clarity when illusions had shattered. "That depends," I said carefully, "on whether we're both willing to do the hard work of rebuilding, not just from the affair, but from all the ways we've been disconnected these past few years. It won't be easy. It might not even be possible. But you're willing to try?" she asked, a fragile hope in her voice. I took a deep breath, making perhaps the most difficult tactical decision of my life. In the field, you sometimes had to risk everything on an uncertain outcome because the alternative was unacceptable. This felt similar, stepping into unknown territory without guarantees, but knowing that walking away without trying would mean certain defeat. "Yes," I said finally. "I'm willing to try." Sarah reached for my hand tentatively, her fingers cool, against mine. I didn't pull away. After a moment she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't deserve a second chance." "Maybe not," I agreed. "But sometimes life isn't about what we deserve. It's about what we're willing to fight for." She squeezed my hand gently. "Thank you for fighting for me tonight, even after everything I did." I looked at her, really looked at her. For what felt like the first time in months, beyond the betrayal, beyond the pain she'd caused, I saw the woman I'd married 15 years ago, flawed, human, capable of terrible mistakes, but also of growth, of change, of redemption. "Get some rest," I said, releasing her hand and standing up. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." As I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, I felt the weight of the night's events settling on my shoulders. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion unlike anything I'd felt since my active duty days. In the bathroom, I splashed cold water on my face and stared at my reflection in the mirror. The man looking back at me wasn't just a betrayed husband or a former Special Forces operator. He was both, and more, a man at a crossroads, facing perhaps the most complicated mission of his life. Rebuilding a marriage after infidelity was challenging enough. Doing so after tonight's violence, after seeing the depths to which Mitchell had been willing to go, added layers of complexity that would take time to navigate. But for the first time in weeks, I felt something beyond anger and betrayal, something that resembled hope, fragile, uncertain, but present. But whether it would be enough remained to be seen. I dried my face and returned to the bedroom, where Sarah had already changed and lay curled on her side of the bed, her back to the door. I could tell from her breathing that she wasn't asleep. Without speaking, I settled on my side of the bed, maintaining the physical distance that had become habitual in recent months. But something had shifted between us. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. Tomorrow would bring police statements, legal proceedings, difficult conversations. But tonight, in the quiet aftermath of violence, we had both survived. And sometimes survival is the first step toward healing. As I drifted towards sleep, I found myself thinking of something my team leader had said after a particularly harrowing operation in Afghanistan. The hardest battles aren't the ones where you know the enemy. They're the ones where you have to figure out what victory actually looks like. In the darkness of our bedroom, with the echo of gunfire still ringing in my memory, I wondered what victory would look like for us. Not the military definition. Enemy. Neutralized, objective secured, extraction complete. Something more complex, more personal. Perhaps victory wasn't about winning or losing at all. Perhaps it was about finding a path forward from the wreckage, together or apart, that allowed both of us to heal. It was the last thought I had before exhaustion claimed me, plunging me into the first dreamless sleep I'd had since discovering Sarah's betrayal. The weeks following Mitchell's arrest unfolded in a blur of police statements, legal proceedings, and uncomfortable conversations. The day after the incident, Sarah and I sat in separate interview rooms at the police station, recounting the events that had transformed our lives in the span of 24 hours. The detective assigned to our case was a former Marine, and I recognized the familiar way he carried himself, the alertness, the economy of movement that never quite leaves you after military service. "Walk me through it again," he said, reviewing my statement. "Bennett comes to your house, intoxicated, pulls a weapon, and you disarmed him without injury. That's pretty impressive restraint given the circumstances." I described the sequence of events in the detached, factual manner I'd been trained to use for after-action reports. No emotional language, no embellishments, just the objective reality of what had transpired. "You know," the detective said, setting down his pen and leaning back in his chair, "most guys in your situation would have done a lot worse to a man who showed up at their house waving a gun around. Especially after finding out about the affair." I shrugged. "Violence beyond. What's necessary to neutralize a threat isn't justified, not in combat and not at home." He studied me for a moment, that look of recognition passing between us. Two men who had operated in environments where these principles weren't just philosophical positions, but survival mechanisms. "The DA is pressing charges against Bennett, regardless of what you and your wife decide," he informed me. Unlawful possession of a firearm, breaking and entering, assault with a deadly weapon, attempted murder. He's looking at serious time unless his lawyer works some magic. I nodded, unsurprised. The legal system had its own momentum once set in motion. "What about you and Mrs. Wilson?" he asked, his tone shifting slightly. "Will you be staying together? After all this?" The question caught me off guard, not because I hadn't considered it, but because I hadn't expected it from him. It must have shown on my face. "Sorry," he said. "Off the record. Just seen a lot of marriages fall apart after less." "We're taking it day by day," I replied simply. He nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer. That's usually the best approach. With anything. On the drive home, Sarah broached the subject we'd been dancing around for days. "The detective asked me if I was going to a hotel," she said quietly, staring out the passenger window. "He seemed surprised when I said I was going home with you." "What did you tell him?" "That we were working through things." She turned to look at me. "Is that true, James? Are we working through things, or are we just postponing the inevitable?" It was a fair question. The night of Mitchell's arrest, adrenaline and crisis had created a momentary truce. But in the clear light of day, the fundamental issues remained. Trust had been broken, vows had been violated. The foundation of our 15-year marriage had cracked in ways that might not be repairable. "I don't know what's inevitable," I said finally, keeping my eyes on the road. "I know what's possible, if we're both committed to doing the work. And what work is that? Honesty, counseling, rebuilding trust." I glanced at her briefly. "And not just about the affair, about everything that led to it. The distance between us these past few years, that's on both of us." She nodded slowly. "I'd like to try, if you're willing." "I am," I said, realizing as the words left my mouth that they were true. Despite everything, I wasn't ready to walk away from 15 years of marriage, from the woman who'd stood by me through multiple deployments, who'd built a life with me despite the unique challenges of being married to someone in special forces. The next day, Mitchell's face was splashed across the local news. "Prominent doctor arrested after armed confrontation," read the headline. The hospital had placed him on immediate administrative leave pending investigation, and the state medical board had opened their own inquiry. Sarah watched the news report in silence, her expression unreadable. When they showed Mitchell's mugshot, disheveled, hollow-eyed, a far cry from the polished professional who had seduced her, she turned away. "I can't believe I was so blind," she whispered. "We see what we want to see in people," I replied. "Not unkindly, especially when they're showing us their best face." "It wasn't just that," she admitted. "I wanted to feel important, special. Working at the hospital, I was just another administrator. With him, I was something more." The honesty was painful but necessary. These were the conversations we needed to have if there was any hope of rebuilding. 2 weeks after the incident, we received a call from the district attorney's office. Mitchell had accepted a plea deal, 2 years probation, mandatory counseling, and a restraining order preventing him from contacting either of us. His medical license was suspended for a minimum of 5 years, with reinstatement contingent upon psychiatric evaluation. "He got off light," Sarah commented when I told her. "The system isn't perfect," I replied, "but his career is effectively over. For someone like Mitchell, that might be a harsher punishment than jail time." The legal resolution provided closure of a sort, but the emotional aftermath was more complex. Sarah and I existed in a strange limbo, not separated but not fully reconciled either. We inhabited the same house, shared meals, engaged in careful conversations that skirted the edges of our pain without diving too deeply. 3 weeks after Mitchell's arrest, I came home to find a business card on the kitchen counter. Dr. Rebecca Levine, marriage counselor, specializing in infidelity recovery and military families. Sarah was waiting, nervous, when I picked up the card. "I made an appointment," she said, "for both of us, if you're willing." The fact that she'd found someone who specialized in both aspects of our situation, the affair and the military background, told me she'd put thought into this. It wasn't a token gesture. "When?" I asked. "Thursday at 2 Sacho." I nodded. "I'll be there." The look of relief on her face was palpable. I realized she'd been expecting resistance, perhaps even refusal. The fact that she'd made the appointment anyway showed a commitment I hadn't been sure she possessed. Dr. Levine's office was neutral territory, a simple professional space with comfortable chairs arranged in a triangle rather than the confrontational, face-to-face setup I'd expected. She herself was a woman in her 50s with quick, intelligent eyes and a direct manner I appreciated. "Let me be clear about something from the start," she said after introductions. "My job isn't to save your marriage or push you toward divorce. My job is to help you communicate effectively and make decisions based on clarity rather than confusion or pain. Whatever outcome you choose, I want it to be a choice, not a default." I found myself approving of her approach. In the military, we'd valued clear objectives and honest assessments over false hope or sugar-coated realities. In our first session, she asked a question that cut to the heart of everything. "What are you fighting for? Not against. Affairs, betrayal, those are what you're fighting against. But what positive outcome are you both fighting for?" Sarah and I looked at each other, neither immediately answering. "Take your time," Dr. Levine said. "This isn't a question with a right or wrong answer, but it's important to know what you're working toward, not just what you're working through." After a long moment, Sarah spoke. "I'm fighting for the chance to become the person I should have been all along. The wife who communicates instead of retreats, the partner who faces problems head-on instead of seeking escape." I considered my answer carefully. In the military, objectives had always been clear. Missions had defined parameters, success criteria, extraction plans. But this was different, more complex, more personal. "I'm fighting for peace," I said finally. "Not just the absence of conflict, but actual peace, the kind I never really found after coming home." Dr. Levine nodded. "Those are good places to start." The work with Dr. Levine was harder than any mission I'd undertaken in 15 years of special operations. There were days when the pain seemed too great, the betrayal too significant to move past. Days when Sarah's guilt overwhelmed her ability to engage. Days when my own anger threatened to derail whatever progress we'd made. "You compartmentalize exceptionally well," Dr. Levine observed during one of our individual sessions. "It's a skill that served you well in your military career, but in a marriage, it can become a barrier. Is that why I can sit here and discuss my wife's affair so calmly?" I asked. "Because I've boxed it up?" She considered this. "Partly, but I think it's also because you understand something many people don't, that emotions, while real and valid, aren't always reliable guides for action. You've been trained to act based on objectives and values rather than feelings, and that's good." I wasn't sure if she was complimenting or criticizing this tendency. "It's both," she replied. "It gives you stability during crisis, which is valuable, but it can also create distance when connection is needed. The trick is knowing which situations call for which approach." Sarah had her own challenges to work through in therapy. During a joint session 2 months into our counseling, she finally articulated something that had been simmering beneath the surface. "I never really understood what you did before," she admitted. "Not really. I knew the general outline. Special. Forces, dangerous missions, things you couldn't talk about. But seeing you that night with Mitchell, it was like meeting a different person, someone I'd been married to for 15 years, but never truly seen." That side of me doesn't belong at home, I said. It never did. But it's part of you, she countered. A significant part. How can I know you, really know you, if that piece is always hidden? Dr. Levine leaned forward. James, what do you think about that? Is there a way to integrate these parts of yourself more completely? The question struck at something fundamental, the compartmentalization that had kept me functional through years of combat and its aftermath. The separation between the operator and the husband had seemed necessary, protective. But Sarah's words made me wonder if it had also created the distance that had made her vulnerable to Mitchell's attention. I don't know, I said honestly. I've never tried. Maybe that's part of our work here, Dr. Levine suggested. Slowly, incrementally, things began to shift. We learned to communicate in ways we never had before. Sarah started to understand the parts of my military experience that had shaped me. The hypervigilance, the emotional compartmentalization, the challenges of transitioning to civilian life. And I began to see how my emotional unavailability had created a void in our marriage, one that Mitchell had exploited, but that had existed before he ever entered the picture. 3 months after the incident, we attended Mitchell's sentencing hearing. He'd accepted the plea deal we'd been informed about, but the judge had discretion on certain aspects. We sat in the back of the courtroom, watching as Mitchell stood before the judge in a suit that now seemed to hang on his frame. The confident, arrogant doctor was gone, replaced by a man humbled by consequences. When given the opportunity to speak, Mitchell surprised me. I want to apologize to Dr. and Mrs. Wilson, he said, his voice steady but subdued. My actions were inexcusable. The affair was a betrayal of professional ethics and personal morality. Bringing a weapon to their home was criminal and dangerous. I can only say that I was not in my right mind, and I am committed to getting the help I need to ensure nothing like this ever happens again. The judge accepted his plea, but added a requirement that he complete not just counseling, but a comprehensive addiction treatment program. Apparently, the pre-sentencing investigation had revealed a pattern of alcohol abuse that had escalated over the past year. As we left the courthouse, Sarah asked, "Do you think he'll get his life back on track?" I considered the question, thinking about the men I'd known in the service who had fallen and risen again, and others who had continued their downward spiral despite every opportunity for redemption. That depends on whether he learns from this, or just blames everyone else for his downfall. I hope he gets help, she said quietly, for whatever drove him to become the person who would do something like that. Her compassion, even for the man who had nearly destroyed our marriage and threatened our lives, reminded me of the woman I'd fallen in love with years ago. Someone who could see humanity even in those who had wronged her. 6 months into our therapy, Dr. Levine suggested we consider whether staying in the house was helpful or harmful to our recovery. Places hold memories, she explained. Sometimes a fresh start in a new environment can be beneficial. Sarah and I discussed the idea over dinner that evening. The house that had once been our sanctuary now carried too many painful associations. Sarah's deceptions, Mitchell's violent intrusion, the breakdown of trust that had occurred within those walls. "What do you think?" Sarah asked, pushing her food around her plate. "Could you leave this place?" I looked around the kitchen where we'd shared thousands of meals, celebrated birthdays, argued over bills, existed in the ordinary magic of daily life. But I also saw the entryway where I'd disarmed Mitchell, the living room where I'd confronted him about the affair, the bedroom where Sarah had lied beside me night after night. "I think Dr. Levine might be right," I said. "Too much has happened here." Sarah nodded, relief evident in her expression. "I've been having nightmares about that night, about what might have happened if you hadn't—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. We decided to sell the house. Finding a new home together became a symbolic commitment to our future, a tangible representation of our choice to rebuild rather than retreat. The process of house hunting became unexpectedly therapeutic. Each property we viewed represented possibilities, choices to be made together. We found ourselves discussing preferences we'd never articulated before, discovering aspects of each other's tastes and priorities that had gone unexplored during our years of disconnection. We eventually settled on a modest craftsman-style house, near a nature preserve, a place with character but no history, at least not for us. A blank canvas for whatever came next. On the day we moved into our new place, after the movers had left, and we were surrounded by boxes waiting to be unpacked, Sarah handed me a small, wrapped package. "What's this?" I asked, surprised. "Open it," she said, a nervous smile playing at her lips. Inside was a journal bound in leather, with my initials embossed on the cover. "Dr. Levine mentioned that writing can help process trauma," she explained. "Not just from what happened with Mitchell, but from your time in service too. Things you might not be ready to say out loud, but need to express somehow." I ran my fingers over the journal, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "Thank you." "There's something else," she said, reaching into her pocket. She pulled out a small velvet box and handed it to me. Inside was a simple silver band, a new wedding ring, to replace the one I'd stopped wearing when I discovered her affair. "I'm not asking you to wear it yet," she said hastily. "I know we're not there, but I wanted you to have it as a promise that I'm committed to earning back your trust no matter how long it takes." I closed the box carefully, emotions threatening to overwhelm the composure I'd maintained for so long. "One day at a time," I said, meeting her eyes. "That's all we can do." She nodded, understanding. That night, as Sarah slept beside me in our new bedroom, I opened the journal and began to write. Not just about Mitchell or the affair, or the moment when my military training had intersected with my personal life in ways I never could have anticipated. I wrote about everything: deployments, transitions, the complicated reality of loving someone while carrying the weight of experiences they couldn't fully understand. I wrote about the first time I'd killed a man in combat, a memory I'd never shared with Sarah or anyone outside my unit, about the nightmares that still occasionally woke me in cold sweat, about the parts of myself I'd walled off to remain functional, both in war and in peace. Writing the words made me realize something important. The skills that had saved our lives the night Mitchell came with his gun weren't just physical. The real training that had served me well was emotional discipline, the ability to assess a situation clearly despite personal feelings, to make decisions based on desired outcomes rather than immediate impulses, to recognize when fighting was necessary and when restraint was the stronger choice. Those same skills were what would save our marriage, if anything could, but they needed to be balanced with a new kind of openness, a willingness to integrate the compartmentalized parts of myself into a more complete whole that Sarah could truly know and understand. Over the following months, our new home began to feel like exactly that, a home, not just a house. We established new routines, created new memories, built new patterns of interaction that didn't carry the shadows of past betrayals. It wasn't perfect. There were still difficult days, painful conversations, moments when trust felt like a distant goal rather than a present reality. But there were good days too, days when laughter came easily, when connection felt natural rather than forced, when we caught glimpses of the couple we had once been and might become again. 8 months after Mitchell's arrest, Sarah received a job offer from a hospital in a neighboring county, a fresh start professionally to match our new beginning at home. The position came with more responsibility and better compensation, but more importantly, it removed her from the environment where her affair with Mitchell had unfolded. "What do you think?" she asked, showing me the offer letter. "It's a longer commute, but I think you should take it," I said without hesitation, "if it's what you want." She studied my face, searching for signs of doubt or reservation. "I've been applying to jobs for months," she admitted. "I didn't want to tell you until something came through. I needed to make this change for myself, not just because of what happened." I appreciated her honesty, both about the job search and her reasons for it. It was evidence of the personal growth she'd committed to in Dr. Levine's office all those months ago. "I'm proud of you," I said, and meant it. 10 months into our recovery journey, Dr. Levine suggested we consider renewing our vows, not as a declaration that all was resolved, but as a conscious commitment to the path we'd chosen together. "Think of it as establishing a new baseline," she explained. "Not erasing what happened, but creating a clear delineation between then and now." Sarah and I discussed the idea privately, weighing its symbolic power against the risk of premature celebration. "I'm not ready to wear the ring yet," I told her honestly, "but I like the idea of marking how far we've come." "What if it's just us?" she suggested. "Not a big ceremony with family and friends, just you and me, saying words that mean something now, not just repeating what we said 15 years ago." The simplicity of her proposal appealed to me. I'd like that. 1 year after Mitchell's arrest, Sarah and I returned to the park where we'd exchanged our original wedding vows. No minister this time, no witnesses, just the two of us, standing beneath the same oak tree where we'd promised our lives to each other 15 years earlier. The day was overcast, a light drizzle falling, intermittently. We hadn't planned for rain, but somehow it felt appropriate, a reminder that commitment isn't just for sunny days, but for all weather, all seasons. "I don't know if we'll make it," I said honestly, holding her hands in mine. "But I know we're both fighting for something worth saving. I know that what we're building now is more real, more honest than what we had before. And I know that whatever happens, I'm grateful for this chance to truly know you and to let myself be known." Sarah squeezed my hands, tears in her eyes, but a strength in her expression that had been forged through our shared ordeal. "I promise to face problems with you, not escape from them. To speak truth even when it's difficult. To remember that love isn't just a feeling, but a choice we make every day." There beneath the oak tree, with rain misting our faces, we chose each other again, not with the blind optimism of our first wedding, but with clear eyes that had seen both the best and worst in each other, and still decided to continue the journey together. As we walked back to the car, her hand in mine, I reflected on how strange life's trajectories can be. I had spent 15 years training for combat in distant lands, never imagining that the most important battle would take place in my own home, or that the greatest test of my training would be choosing mercy over vengeance when facing my wife's lover. I didn't know what the future held for us. Marriage after infidelity is never easy, and adding violence to that equation had created complications few couples ever face. But I did know one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever came next, I would face it with the same discipline, focus and commitment that had carried me through 15 years in special forces. Some battles are fought with weapons, others with words, patience and forgiveness. In the end, it's not the nature of the conflict that matters, but the strength you bring to it and your reason for fighting in the first place. As we drove home to our new home, the one without ghosts or painful memories, I realized that I was ready for something I hadn't been prepared to do for a long time. When we arrived, I went to the drawer where I'd kept the silver ring Sarah had given me months earlier. I opened the box, took out the ring and slipped it onto my finger. It felt strange at first, a weight I'd grown unaccustomed to, but it also felt right. A tangible symbol of a choice made freely, with full awareness of both the risks and the possibilities. When Sarah saw it on my hand, her eyes filled with questions she was afraid to ask. "One day at a time," I said, echoing the words I'd spoken the day she'd given it to me. "Today, this feels right." She smiled through tears, understanding exactly what this moment meant. Not an end to our journey of recovery, but a milestone worth marking. Not a declaration that all wounds were healed, but an acknowledgement that healing was possible. One day at a time, she agreed, taking my hand, the one with the ring, in hers. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.